Welcome to today's lecturette. I'm Dr. Leslie Jones, and today we're going to begin our final topic for this unit as we take a look at what makes effective public policy that supports children, families in our local communities. And we'll begin by taking a brief overview of the unit and the time that we've spent together and the discussions and topics that we've shared before moving on to looking at what are the aspects that make up effective public policy. So far in this unit, we've examined a range of issues and constructs relevant to children, families, and communities. In Module 1, you may remember that we discussed the ways in which children have been positioned historically and the use of research and data to better understand children and families, and the dynamics of child well-being and family functioning. We also looked at public policy in practice and its impact on children and families. In this module, we've taken a closer look at the role of community, beginning with a close look at culture and its influence on child development. We've also discussed community disadvantage and children living in fragile contexts, including last week's look at community responses to child protection issues. Our discussion now turns to a broader view of what helps make public policy effective in supporting children and families within their local communities. We have, during this unit, used a number of examples of public policy in practice, and today we're going to take a look at what are the underpinning and enabling conditions that make public policy effective. Throughout this unit, we've referenced Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, of which I'm quite sure you're all really familiar with by now. And we've used it as an organising framework to understand the interplay between the broader socio-political and cultural contexts and personal contexts that influence child development. We have situated child development within the context of the family and community, examining the multiple influences of and the biodirectional interplay between the many contexts in which children live, grow and develop. We have examined examples of public policy, both historically and contemporary policy agendas, for their lasting influence over the many facets of life impacting children's lives. In our lecturette next week, we're actually going to take a final look at the synthesis of these public policies and their specific impacts. However, first, I would like to take some time to look beyond the definitions and understandings of context and the specific examples we've explored to answer a much broader question, and that is, what makes a public policy effective? Your text identifies through the framework of prevention science that there are some recognisable elements that make public policy effective, and these include things such as that policy needs to be informed by research and evidence in order to make it effective, that programs need to be adequately funded, and that funding is provided for long enough to accomplish the objectives of the program, and finally that effective public policy needs to be scalable, and that means that public policy develops programs that can be taken from small scale studies such as pilots or prototypes and made into something that can be deployed in the much broader communities in order to meet the needs of a much broader audience than small niche programs. And so now I just want to take a closer look at each of those three dynamics of effective public policy. Effective public policy needs to be informed by reliable evidence. Research about social and developmental issues is critical to understanding the depth, breadth and specifics of the problem that public policy is setting out to address. Research provides reliable mechanisms for the development, the implementation and the evaluation of public policy efficacy. It is the policy response answering the central question, and through research we can see if the public policy is on track or whether it needs some sort of adjustments and refinements and steer to get it back to where it needs to be to address the central issue. Without evidence, public policy runs the risk of being a knee-jerk response to a politicised or a sensationalised issue. The strategies are apt to be focused in the wrong direction. In considering the effectiveness of any public policy, there is a critical consideration of sustainable funding. Public policy initiatives, such as the CCS public policy that we've spoken about in previous lecturettes, for example, requires billions of dollars every year just to sustain the initiative of providing families with financial support to access early learning programs. Public policy that is underfunded or receives funding for a short period of time will undoubtedly run into implementation issues. This is a particular concern for community early intervention programs that we've spoken a lot about during this unit, that often receive funding for a short number of years, sometimes only 3 years, before they have to go back into submitting applications for further funding. And often at the 3-year mark, some of those community programs are actually defunded altogether. For families and children and professionals working in these community support programs, the insecurity of funding is a considerable barrier to long-term efficacy. And for families and children in particular, where they may be living in areas of disadvantage, when funding is not stable and not secure, and when programs are started and then defunded, and then other programs are started and defunded, we have an issue in those communities around families disengaging from support services because they get fatigued around programs that are only there for a short period of time before they're moving on to something else. The funding issue around effective public policy is also informed by evidence and research. Funding relies on evidence to give the government some advice around how much funding might be required to sustain a program, how long the funding should be available for, and to who the funding is actually allocated. All of these considerations that are generated through research data help the government to understand the total volume of funding needed to sustain a public policy. And therefore, funding considerations are a pillar of effective public policy. As you might imagine, getting the funding allocations right for public policy is a really important piece of work for government. Too little funding and the programs are unlikely to reach the objectives that the government sets out for public policy in the first place. And too much funding is definitely seen as a waste of public money, and something that also brings into question the sustainability when we aren't efficient in the way in which we use public funds to support our local communities and children and families. Public policy, as we know, is an artefact of the macro system and is understandably focused on addressing community and social issues that impact the broader aspects of the population. Niche programs and policies will always exist, but governments are not uncommonly interested in the viability of taking a policy and a program that is in a niche environment to the larger audience. This notion of scalability often secures long-term funding as a result. If a program is showing potential for a small group and is viable, it makes sense to take it to a larger implementation approach, and therefore investing in the initiatives makes more sense if they're scalable. Sometimes the designs of niche programs do not suit being taken to a larger scale. In these circumstances, these policies can become a really targeted approach, which has some elements of scalability if they can find replicable niche issues that they can apply the model to as well. Programs that have the potential to be scaled and made larger for a larger audience is one way of securing sustainable funding and longevity in the policy implementation. Another aspect of successful public policy is this notion around moving to an integrated approach. The integration of services is now really quite commonly recognised in contemporary policy as a best practice model. It provides common sense logic to increase the impact of service provision to support children, families or communities, to have relevant agencies working together with a shared purpose rather than in disciplinary silos. The general characteristics of successful collective approaches to support programs include things such as the groups having a common agenda, having a shared measurement system, so talking the same sorts of language about what they're actually, what does success actually look like, and how will we measure that and know. Having mutually reinforced activities so that the activities actually support and value add to each of the other types of activities that may be going on within a collective environment. Communication is clearly an important aspect of how, when we have diverse groups of people working together, that they stay on the same page and focused in the same direction. And another aspect of the success of this collective integrated approach is the supporting agency or an organisation that provides the backbone to the groups of services that are working together. And they provide an organisational support for those people that are working with children or families in their local communities. Another aspect of an integrated approach is that it provides a mechanism by which funds can be pooled together, allowing the collective approaches to be more flexible to where allocations of limited funds may be best deployed. Integration also increases the collective bidding power of consortiums of agencies for the limited funds that may be available from either state or federal governments, rather than 6 agencies applying for the one source of funding. When they come together in an integrated services approach, it's one application and they are much more likely to succeed. The development of networks also facilitates for an integrated approach to social and community issues affecting children and families. Networks are an effective mechanism for information sharing of what each member of the network is actually doing around a centralised issue. Networks also provide an opportunity for people doing the same type of work to have a place and a space to come together and share information, discuss issues, and collectively work on local solutions. Networks tend to be fairly informal in their structure, and it's really a pulling together of like-minded people around a central issue or as a professional forum for discussions. An emerging form of an integrated approach is that of collective impact approaches. They're characterised by the recognition that a consortium of agencies is likely to need to be working on one centralised issue for an extended period of time. They are usually formed to address complex, entrenched and packaged social issues. Unlike the formation of most networks, however, they're usually multidisciplinary, although we are starting to see a growing number of networks being multidisciplinary as well. Collective impact consortiums have a sponsoring or organising body that centralises administrative aspects of the work and acts as that organisational element to the collective. The formal nature of the collective impact approach also means they seek grants for ongoing funding to support their work. The potential for positive impact from these types of collective consortiums goes without saying. Bringing multidisciplinary teams together to work on complex social issues that are long-standing makes sense to pool resources, expertise and experience together to solve a social issue together. Notwithstanding that, there are a number of challenges in bringing multidisciplinary teams together, and there needs to be much further work done around understanding what makes a collective impact consortium effective and understanding where are the barriers and hurdles that such teams need to overcome in order to land the potential of the positive impact that they can make in our local communities. Often when we're talking about effective public policy, there is a comment made around families being hard to reach, and your text challenges that notion and really asks the questions, is it really hard to reach families or hard to access services? And the quote you can see on your screen is a really quite powerful one, and it says that this term, meaning hard to reach families, implies fault on the part of the family. Their disengagement is seen as a result of a lack of ability or willingness to connect with the support available. So it describes those children and families who we know are in need of support across a range of whole different areas, including education, health, financial support, etc. Yet for a range of reasons do not access the support programs available. And in many cases, these are support programs that are designed specifically to meet their needs. So this term, hard to reach families, is used to describe whole groups of people and therefore presents a significant generalisation of families and children's experience of social disadvantage or complex problems. Generalisations such as this can lead to stereotyping of people and is uniquely unhelpful in finding workable solutions to improve access to services. The emerging question of access is shifting the discourse to an examination of service provision itself. By looking at the structure and operationalisation of social and community service provisions, we are able to provide more helpful information about why families may find it difficult to engage with the support that's on offer. This shift is moving the discussion from a deficit model of the blame being situated in the families to an objective, critical examination of how services are developed, resourced and implemented. This approach assists organisations to move to a more productive, solution-focused approach that is making access easier. So, for example, providing maternal health nurses in a community hub is a common and extremely helpful community service. However, if the public transport is lacking in areas where young families do not potentially own their own cars, accessing maternal health services may be quite difficult, if not impossible, for families living too far away to walk to the hub. So, a focus on removing access barriers has led many community agencies to consider how they provide, for instance, free transport to ensure that families can access the services that they are providing. We often see transport as a common strategy in early learning centres. Buses to pick up and drop off children support children's access to early learning where the lack of transport might be a barrier. This shift in thinking is about the structural and practice aspects of service provision and is relevant for individual professional practice as well. It represents a shift of critical reflection that is equally important for the individual professional working with children to examine their own practices when things are not working as well as you would like. It is easy to fall into the trap of seeing the issues as a child or family issue. Leaning into the discomfort of examining the ways in which you are working and engaging with families is sometimes challenging, but infinitely productive in helping remove obstacles to relationships, communication, and effective pedagogies. And it's nearly impossible to achieve that when educators come from a deficit model of the issue being the family or the child's fault. Developing effective public policy approaches and personal pedagogies is highly relevant for contemporary practice being enacted in our local communities. Next week, we'll take a final look at some of the macro-level public policy designs and its impact for supporting children, families, and communities. Thank you for joining me for today's lecturette, and I look forward to our next session together.